Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Stormkeep. My name is Paul, and I'm joined today by Morgonk and James. How are you guys doing?
We're doing pretty good. Ready to work on some math today.
Yeah, I hope you guys did
Yeah,
your
ready for this.
homework.
Excited for this lesson. Oh yeah.
You got the text that I sent ahead. You studied your materials. You're all ready for another episode of Paul Lecture Series.
hmm
All right, today we are talking about mortal wounds. More than that, really, because to talk about mortal wounds, we kind of have to do like a whole discussion about the concept of effective health. And I figured while we were doing that, we could look at stuff like what is save stacking? Are wards the counters to mortal wounds? Why were we in the monster meta? Because a lot of people thought it was because of rampages and things like that, and I don't think that's the case, right? So while we talk about this, we're going to explain things like the concept of effective health and ward saves. We're going to look at the impact of ward rolls on gameplay. We're going to look at the concepts of accuracy and damage when it comes to how attacks are made in this game. And then we're going to break down the save characteristics in a lot of detail. We're going to talk about saves against Rend values. We're going to look at the concept of save stacking, what it is, how to counter it, and we're going to look at the differences between saves and wards and their similarities as well. And then finally, we can talk about mortal wounds. It's a really long way to get to this topic, but I promise you it's worth it. And when you come out of this, you're going to have a phenomenal understanding of mortal wounds aren't actually that amazing. They're good, but they're not like breaking the game by any way. And then from there, we're going to launch into a discussion about the rock, paper, scissors design of Age of Sigmar and where mortal wounds fall into that. The concept of effective health, simply put, is the damage you need to slay a model. So, for example, really simple example, if you have a 100 wound model, it would take 100 damage to slay it. So we can say that that model has an effective health of 100. And that sounds pretty stupid, right? Oh, well, obviously, a 100 model takes 100 wounds to kill. But what if that model gains a ward save, right? So a ward, a 6-up ward in this case, negates on average about 1 in 6 damage taken. If you roll a dice, 1 in those 6 will get negated. So the 100 damage you deal to that model would get reduced to about 83 damage. So in order to slay a 100 wound model with a 6-up ward, you have to actually deal an average of 120 wounds, not 100. Therefore, we can say a 100 wound model with a 6-up ward has an effective health of 120. In that case, a 6-up ward, which is a 17% reduction in damage, is actually a 20% increase in effective health. So as quick examples, a unit of 4 Fulminators in Hammers of Sigmar using their ward ability are actually 29 wounds, effectively, instead of 24, as long as they're fighting wholly within range of an objective. So it's not actually that big of a gain on a small unit of Fulminators, only about 5 more wounds. It is like having another Dracoth there, and it is a dice game, sometimes you roll high, sometimes you roll low. A unit of 10 Hearthguard Berserkers can gain a 6-up ward through various means, and instead of being 20 wounds, they become 24 wounds. A nice little bump. Not too impactful, I'm sure, as everybody can attest. Getting a 6-up ward doesn't really feel that huge in the game.
I agree. It's just a Hail Mary. Feels like that's what it feels like most of the time.
Yeah, it's like an annoyance when it happens. You never rely on it. Now, if that model gains a 5-up ward, it negates 2 out of the 6 damage taken on average, rather than 1 in 6. And therefore, the total damage, the 100 damage we dealt before, would actually get reduced down to 66. So in order to slay a 100 wound model, you would actually have to deal an average of 150 wounds, which means a 100 wound model with a 5-up ward has an effective health of 150. Which means a 5-up ward, which is a 33% reduction in damage, is actually a 50% increase in effective health. And interestingly here, a 5-up ward is only 1 more higher than a 6-up ward, but it's more than double the effective health of a 6-up ward. We go from 20% with a 6 to 50% with a 5-up ward.
Yep.
So here's some simple examples, common examples you'll see in the game. Sequitors, which have 2 wounds, gain a 5-up ward in the combat phase, making them effectively 3 wounds. Krondys, an 18 wound monster, can gain a 5-up ward by having a little pet Gardas near him, and that makes Krondys effectively 27 wounds. Rotigus is a Nurgle monster with 20 wounds and a 5-up ward, so he is effectively 30 wounds. And now if the cycle is active, the correct one, and Nurgle heroes get a 4-up ward, then he actually goes up to 40 wounds, which we'll detail in just a second. So if a model has a 4-up wound, it actually negates 3 and 6 damage, or half. 100 damage gets reduced down to 50, and in order to slay a 100 wound model, you actually have to deal 200 wounds. What that means is that a 100 wound model with a 4-up ward has an effective health of 200, and that a 50% reduction in damage is a 100% increase in effective health. So a character like Andrasta, who has 8 wounds with a 4-up ward, is actually effectively 16 wounds. A unit of Hearthguard Berserkers, which is 20 wounds, that we talked about previously when they got a 6-up ward, now they get their 4-up ward through their ability by being near a hero, and they're effectively 40 wounds. And that's why it feels so difficult to chew through a brick of Hearthguard Berserkers and to kill any unit with a 4-up ward, because they have double the effective health based on their War Scroll.
Mm-hmm.
And here's a full chart. I'm not going to break down every single one, but basically, the higher you'll notice on the effective health category, as the ward save gets better and better, the effective health goes out of control. Right? On a 4-up, you're doubling, but on a 3-up ward, you're tripling your effective health, and then on a 2-up ward, you're what's the word for this? Sextupling your effective health. It's crazy. And that's why Gotrek feels like such a beast to take down, because he has an effective wounds of 24. And he also reduces damage, all damage, to 1. So you have to deal 24 packets of 1 damage to kill Gotrek on average. And let's just be glad that there are no models in the game currently with a 2-up ward, because that would be the worst thing. That would just be awful.
Yep.
And here you can see it in a chart. That effective health does not scale linearly with wards. Increasing your ward from a 4 to a 3 is a bigger boost than going from a 6 to a 5. Now, this doesn't usually happen during a game. Ward rolls are not one of these things that you can increase willy-nilly. Most units don't even have ward rolls, and the few ones that do are static. That's usually, a 5, a 6, sometimes a 4, very rarely a 3. Now, the impacts of ward... The impact of having a ward on the gameplay itself. Units in Age of Sigmar typically deal a fixed amount of maximum damage, right? So if you have 30 damage and you need to deal 60 effective wounds, that means you need to put 2 units in range in order to deal that damage, right? You can't suddenly go from 30 to 60 wounds. Some units can. That's where bonus attacks and things like that come into play. But it could be difficult to do this, especially with melee units, because of how combat activations work, right? If you have 2 units that need to fight in order to kill something, one unit fights and does the damage, and then the opponent gets to attack, and they kill the second unit before they have a chance to fight. There's also limited range on melee weapons. Pile-in distances are limited, so you might not be able to actually get enough models in range, limiting your maximum damage. And there's always limited space to fight because of terrain and models just taking up space. Like, if you can put things in the way, your models might not get in range, and you're effectively reducing the damage taken. This all gets much easier to do with shooting. This is the power of shooting, and why shooting always feels so oppressively strong, because your opponent doesn't get to interact in all these micro ways that you would with combat. Shooting is just, is it in range? Is it in sight? Okay, here's a bunch of damage. It's a lot easier to do damage, and that's what, Morgonk, you and I refer to this as ranged power projection, the ability to just do something from a distance is very, very useful strategically in this game.
Absolutely. And honestly, in some ways, because of how as you were discussing wards, in a way it's healthy. Because if we had to deal with everything in melee, this game would be very much focused around 1 or 2 models.
Yeah, it just becomes a number crunch to figure out what the most efficient is, and then it's just punching through screens until you get the good one in. So shooting is necessary to keep the game interesting. There's a tipping point, obviously, where shooting becomes too prevalent, and then it's not fun, but that's another discussion for another day. It's important to note that healing is more effective on units with wards. For example, if you heal 3 wounds on a unit with a 4-up ward, your opponent will need to deal 6 more damage in order to kill you. This is why the heroic recovery change in the December 2021 Battlescroll really hurt Andrasta, and why it dropped her down a tier for us in our tier list. Any unit that was relying on heroic recovery and staying in combat and healing up every turn is a lot worse now, because not only did they didn't just lose the D3 healing, they effectively lost D3 healing because they're losing out on that.
Yeah, really, but for all the, I would say, the primes, Bastion, Celestin Prime, and Andrasta, this is Bastion has healing built in, which helps him out. But yeah, this really hurts some of our other heroes, fighty heroes.
Now, it's a good thing overall for the game. It just does
absolutely.
have that knockdown effect on our heroes in particular.
Mm-hmm.
And there is, of course, the strategic value of surviving attacks. Because models keep fighting and moving until you kill them. They keep doing things, right? Even though sometimes they get bracketed and they lose movement and attacks, they still get to do things. They give your opponent options if you don't kill that model. And they can hold objectives, they can block space, right? Because movement requires specific distances away from enemies in most cases. You can block space out on the board, and Age of Sigmar is a game won through movement, right? If your opponent is putting a model on objective and preventing you from getting that objective, then they're winning. So until they're destroyed, they can also be healed and revived, which is a really big deal now with Rally in the game. If you don't fully wipe out a unit, it could just start reviving itself every single turn by using Rally, or healing every turn with Heroic Recovery, or with endless spells or other sources of healing. Furthermore, if you fail to destroy a unit in combat, then you tie down enemies within 3 inches, which further prevents movement. And that's why retreating and charging is one of the most important abilities in Age of Sigmar, and often, I would say often the most overlooked ability. People don't understand how powerful retreat and charge is until you get to like the top tier tournament level. Then people really appreciate how good that ability is.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it is also worth noting, and because we're talking about the gameplay here, ward rolls are dice rolls, and they can swing high, right? Mergog, you could talk all about your experience of trying to kill that Amulet of Destiny Maw Crusher.
Yeah, it was a complete nightmare. And like that's the thing. Once you fail to kill that thing, and you basically spent a turn doing nothing while it heals, and the rest of his army's still alive, you lost the game.
Yeah,
more or less.
It's about resource allocation, right? If you're putting resources into killing this thing and you don't kill it, you've completely wasted those resources. Now, the problem with ward rolls being a dice roll is that it's not possible to predict how much damage is needed to destroy a unit. So you could say, well, I need an average of 90 damage to kill this unit, but it could be just a couple dice rolls and you end up whiffing. So it's better to overcommit resources in order to ensure that a unit is wiped out. And the rule of thumb here is in Age of Sigmar, it is always better to overkill than to underkill. Because when you underkill, things survive and things get messy. It's always better to wipe out units than to leave them straggling alive.
Mm-hmm. Agree.
So previously we said units deal a maximum amount of damage, right? And that maximum damage is the attacks times the damage characteristic. So, for example, if a unit has 10 attacks with 3 damage each, that's like 30 damage right there. And an increase to either the attacks or the damage will increase that maximum damage. So if you have a unit with 5 attacks a model, you increase their attacks by 1, you deal 5 more maximum damage. But obviously that's not how dice games work, right? Units in Age of Sigmar deal a range of damage. You can do anything between 0 and the maximum, and that all depends on the accuracy of the attack. Now the wound characteristic is like the defense version of maximum damage. So conceptualize it this way. If you can only deal 30 damage to a 35 wound model, that's not a useful attack. Whereas if you did 30 damage to a 20 wound model, that's a very useful attack because you've killed that model. So it's all about resource allocation. If you don't kill a Gargant, it's not very useful to do any damage to it. You're better off in a lot of cases just leaving it alive and putting your resources elsewhere.
Mm-hmm.
So this is where the concept of average damage or expected damage comes into play. And that's the most likely result of the dice. And that depends on the hit rolls, the wound rolls, the Rend characteristic of weapons. And an increase of one of these will increase the average damage, but it won't increase the maximum damage, right? Like if your unit of Grandhammer Annihilators has 10 attacks that deal 3 damage each, your max damage is 30. Increasing the hit roll will not increase the max damage. It just increases the average damage, or the expected result of dice rolling normally, right?
Absolutely. Same for long strikes. I mean, no matter what you do, it's max 24.
Yeah, exactly. So an increase to these stats, it's useful to think of them more as accuracy than anything else. And now it's also worth noting that an increase in Rend may not always increase the average damage. It's more to hit and wound. Because the problem with Rend is that there's points where Rend stops mattering. Like, for example, if you have Rend 3 against a 6-up save, it's not as big. Like, that's the same as having Rend 1, right? So more Rend doesn't always equal more damage. Given the way the game currently is right now, with how save stacking works, more Rend is usually always better, right? It's very niche cases that Rend is not useful.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, I agree with that.
So let's take a look at a very simple example in the Stormcast Battletome. Hurricane crossbows are high damage because they can deal a maximum of 26. I'm just talking about 3 models here. But they have fairly low accuracy because they're just on 3s and 3s and no rend. Whereas long strike crossbows are low damage. They're 12. They're less than half the damage of Hurricane crossbows, but they're very accurate. They're 3s and 2s with rend 2. They also do mortal wounds, which adds into their accuracy. But everybody knows that long strike crossbows are really impactful and really powerful and feel very good to use, whereas Hurricane crossbows are terrible, even though they have way higher max damage, right?
Yeah, definitely.
And effective health, like damage and accuracy work together against effective health, right? You can't just use max damage and hope you roll high. That's not a very good tactic.
No, yeah. Have a plan for accuracy.
So let's talk about the save characteristic. So an increase of save characteristic will decrease the average damage taken. And similar to wards, saves actually increase your effective health. So for example, if you have 5 Vanquishers, there are 10 wounds with a 4-up save. If you were to just deal a whole bunch of Rend 0 attacks, you would have to deal about 20 wounds in order to kill them. But then you look at Vindictors, which are 10 wounds as well, but with a 3-up save, and they have effectively 30 wounds, which is 50% higher than with Vanquishers. But then you look at a unit like Annihilators, which have less wounds at 9, but a higher save at 2+, and they have effectively 54 wounds. It's really, really hard to take out Annihilators unless you have high rend or with mortal wounds. So again, we see the same chart here, the damage taken, the save, how much is negated, the effective health, and the percent increase. And it's the exact same scaling that we saw with wards. Right? Like with wards, each +1 to save rolls is worth more than the previous one. So going from 4 to 3 is a bigger deal than going from 6 to 5. And that's why the game designers had to put a cap of +1 in 3rd edition, because they wanted people to use save bonuses, because save bonuses feel good to use, rend weapons feel good to use. But if there's no upper limit on how high saves can go, effective health can go out of control.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, units with a 2+ save are very strong against Rend 0 attacks, but obviously they don't just dominate the game inherently, right? There are very few units with a 2-up save, and the ones we've seen are powerful, but they have some other kind of limitation. And usually that limitation is mortal wounds. Since the save characteristic does nothing against mortal wounds, saves can't really be called effective health in the same way as a ward, but it's convenient to just think of them in the same way, because they do effectively the same thing. It just varies depending on the enemy's rend.
Right.
So let's take a look at how saves and rend are related. So unlike wards, saves are countered by rend characteristic. It's a very, most of the game is rolling attacks and rolling saves. Rend does not increase the maximum damage of a weapon. It doesn't even necessarily increase your accuracy, because as we discussed before, there are situations where rend will not increase your average damage because you've got too much rend and the enemy's save is different. So let's take a look at these 3 units we talked about before, the Vanquishers, the Vindictors, and the Annihilators. And you can see their effective health, depending on the rend of the weapon that hits them. Annihilators start out at 54 and then drop off very harshly down to 27 with only rend 1. Their effective health is halved just because they're getting hit by a rend 1 weapon. Whereas Vanquishers, their effective health goes from 20 to 15. That's not the same kind of drop that we see with Annihilators. So rend it's not quite accuracy, it's more like a decrease to effective health rather than an increase in accuracy. You could call this maybe effective damage, but that's kind of an awkward term to unpack, so I just, rend is what it is. Saves are kind of like effective health, and rend is kind of like accuracy, and it's easier just to think of them in that way.
I mean, it's a modifier in effective health, just like saves are a modifier in effective health. So I'm fine with those terms. So,
but you can see on the chart here, the drop off from just 1 rend against Annihilators is huge.
Mm-hmm. My God.
So while there's no ways to increase a ward roll, there's many, many ways to increase a save roll. Just off the top of from the core rules, we've got All Out Defense, we've got Mystic Shield, and their Finest Hour. And then Battletomes have all sorts of other abilities. For example, Lord Castellan can just pick a Stormcast unit and it has +1 to save. Idoneth Deepkin with their Leviathan, their whole army gets +1 to save. There's a lot of sources of save rolls in this game. And what is save stacking? You might hear this term if you visit any forums or you look at other YouTube channels, you might hear, even us, we probably use the term save stacking. Quick definition here from the core rules: an unmodified save roll of 1 always fails. A save roll cannot be modified by more than +1. This is an exception to the principle that abilities take precedence over core rules. What this means is that a save can never be improved by more than +1 after Rend. And save stacking is when you use multiple save bonuses on a unit to the point where you just start ignoring the Rend on attackers. So for example, if you have a unit of Stormdrake Guard, they have a 3-up save. Let's say they get attacked by an enemy with Rend 1 weapons. Normally, they would roll a save on a 4+ because of the Rend 1. But let's say this unit has Mystic Shield and All-Out Defense, which gives it a +2. Overall, the Stormdrakes end up with a +1 to save rolls, which means that Stormdrakes need to roll a 2+ to make a successful save, and they're effectively 2+ save ignoring Rend 1, which, as we saw, is a crazy high effective health boost. And when you pair that on a unit like Stormdrakes, which are 9 wounds apiece, you get a crazy high amount of effective health. With more bonuses, you could even stack this up higher. Let's say you started using Castellan Lantern or Envoy of the Heavens or other sources of save bonuses. You could start ignoring Rend 2 and Rend 3. And these effects are rare. It's rare in Age of Sigmar to see Rend 2 and Rend 3 weapons. So let's take a look at a quick study. 5 Liberators versus 5 Vindictors. On the left, you'll see a quick chart. They have the same number of wounds, they have the same number of models and the same size bases. One of them has a 3-up save, and the other one has a 4-up save with a +1. Now, because of the core rules, the maximum save that Vindictors would get is a 2+, whereas the maximum save that Liberators could get is a 3+. So, why would anybody use Liberators? Aren't Vindictors just better in every way? Well, let's take a look at it. If both of these units are hit by a Rend 1 attack, they both need to roll a 4+. If they get hit by a Rend 2, they both need to roll a 5+. Although Vindictors can get to a 2+ save, it only matters if you actually have that many bonuses to save and your enemy has no Rend, right? So for most situations, a 3+ save is actually identical to a 4+ with a +1. For example, if save bonuses are less than Rend, there's no difference between these two values. If you have +1 to save and your opponent has Rend 1, these two units have the same save roll. If your save bonuses are equal to the Rend value, the same thing happens. However, if your save bonuses are higher, so for example, if you have +2 to your saves against Rend 1, then in that case, the Vindictors actually get better because they would have a 2-up save while the Liberators would be at a 3-up.
Right.
However, these all cost resources, right? Mystic Shield, All-Out Defense, Warding Lantern, all of these have opportunity costs. You can only use All-Out Defense on 1 unit per turn, and it costs a command point. 1 unit per phase, and it costs a command point. Mystic Shield can only be cast once per turn. It can fail. It can be unbound. Warding Lantern can only be on 1 unit per turn, and it costs a Lord Castellan. So all of these have opportunity costs, and they could be just used on other units, right? With only 10 wounds in a squad of 5 models, a few bad rolls can kill you even if you do save stack. Even if you get like a 2+ save ignoring Rend 4, you can still roll 1s and the models just die. So it's not worth putting save bonuses on a unit with only 10 wounds. They're not likely to survive.
Agreed, yeah.
With only 10 wounds, mortal wounds are also a huge deal, right? D3 mortal wounds is doing somewhere between 10 and 30% of the unit's wounds. Now, this gets different if you have more Vindictors. If you have 10 or 15 Vindictors, if you reinforce the unit, save stacking actually becomes a worthwhile investment because they can survive a couple bad rolls and some mortal wounds, right? D3 mortal wounds against 15 Vindictors is not going to wipe out the unit or pose a serious threat, while D3 mortal wounds to 5 Vindictors would be a big deal. So if you're just using a screen of 5 to fill your battle line or just to put in front of other models, Liberators are cheaper, and that makes them better.
Clarification though, because my brain is a little half dead. I probably know the answer, but why would, where is it? So 100 damage on a 6-up board reduced to 83. Why is it average 120 wounds to kill a 100 wound model then?
Do 120 times 0.83.
Okay, yeah, cool.
Yep. So we've talked about saves and we've talked about wards. And interestingly, they actually stack together multiplicatively to increase your effective health. So a unit with a 4-up save and a 4-up ward doesn't have 200% effective health. They actually have 400% effective health. So for example, if you have those 5 Vanquishers we had before that had an effective health of 20 wounds, well, if you give them a 5-up ward, now they have an effective health of 30 wounds. 5 Vindictors with a 5-up ward, they get 45 wounds. 3 Annihilators go from 54 to 81 effective wounds. Indrasta, effectively 48 wounds because of her high save and her ward. Now, if you give her all-out defense, she gets to a 2-up save with a 4-up ward. She's on effectively 96 wounds. So you can see just how crazy this scaling gets when you bring together high saves and ward rolls. Now, this would normally get negated by Rend, but when you add save stacking into the mix, you can see why there was so many 3-up save hero monsters with wards just crushing the game. It requires...
Gargants in particular, my god. Like when you combine 35 wounds with a 3-up save and a 5-up Amulet of Destiny, god, that was obnoxious.
Yeah, and it takes like a lot of units working together to bring down this high effective health.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very complicated to do, especially when there's 3 other Gargants on the table disrupting you.
Yeah, my favorite combination is Storm Drakes with Mystic Shield, all out defense, if you can get a Castellan in there, and Pet Gardas.
Oh, it's brutal. You can do some really gross things, and that's kind of the hidden allegiance abilities of Stormcast is how their units interact with save stacking. Stormcast are the save stacking army. The monster meta that we've been experiencing since Age of Sigmar 3rd edition launched is actually not because of rampages and battle tactics. It's a result of effective health spiraling out of control. Now, this might not be an issue for most units, since they can only use all-out defense and Mystic Shield, but for heroes, they could also use Finest Hour and Amulet of Destiny. And when you combine all of these things together, it made it really, really difficult to kill a 3-up save hero. And it wasn't just any hero, right? Because wards and saves are a percent multiplier on your wounds. So a 5-wound hero with Amulet of Destiny and +3 to saves, a few bad rolls and he's dead. But their effective health isn't as high as an 18-wound hero with those same buffs. So that's why we saw a lot of things like Maw Crushes with save stacking and an Amulet of Destiny being really, really difficult to kill.
Yep, especially with Heroic Recovery.
Yeah, especially with Heroic Recovery. Following your Finest Hour, you can start healing up. And as we discussed, healing is increased when you have higher effective health. So I personally think that the battle tactics giving bonus points and the monstrous rampages were not the reason we are in a monster meta. I think those are just icing on the cake. People found that these incredibly durable monsters were very impactful, and they took advantage of that. And then they also happened to be scoring more points with it. And this is obviously why they had to nerf the Amulet of Destiny in the December Battlescroll. There was no way that artifact could continue to exist.
Man, not without warping the game around these single models like that, yeah.
Yeah, and it's interesting to note, it's consistent with what we're talking about here, but decreasing it from a 5-up ward to a 6-up ward has completely killed that artifact. Not just because a lot of armies already have 6-up wards, but because a 6-up ward is it's only a 20% increase. It's not that impactful.
At that point, it becomes chance than like actual math working against you. So,
yeah, that falls within the range of error or just variability in dice, right?
Mm-hmm.
All right, so we finally talked about wards and saves. We can talk about mortal wounds. Mortal wounds are like a wound, except they ignore saves entirely. They're essentially a Rend Infinity attack. It doesn't matter how much you save stack. A Rend Infinity attack just cuts through it and does damage, right? Now, unlike standard wounds, they're generally not created by regular attacks, right? A Pistolier shoots, it doesn't do mortal wounds, it does regular wounds. Mortal wounds are created by abilities. Spells, abilities, other effects, but generally through abilities, right? And
yes.
It can be useful to just think of mortal wounds as another attack, but without having hit and wound rolls. They have a different activation effect. Since they don't need to roll to hit or wound, and they ignore saves, they're definitely a high accuracy attack, like a long strike raptor. Now, most mortal wound sources are low. It's 1 or D3 or 2, a D6, or only activates on hit rolls of 6. So they're not high in volume so we can call them low damage, right? So in general, mortal wounds are low damage and high accuracy. And that's not, a strict rule anywhere, but you can see it in the design choices that they've made throughout the armies. So as an example, take a look at Protectors. If you have a Protector with a Star Soul Mace, they can deal D3 mortal wounds on a 2+, and that is expected to do somewhere between 1 and 2 mortal wounds, closer to 2, right?
Mm-hmm.
Whereas Protectors with a Glaive have 5 attacks with Rend 2, that they can expect to do 2.22 damage, and which is about 1.5 damage against a 3-up save. So even though the Glaives are higher damage, they're lower accuracy. Mortal wounds are high accuracy attacks. That's the best way to think of them.
Yeah, agree.
Mortal wounds exist to ensure that effective health scaling doesn't go out of control, right? Things have to die in Age of Sigmar. It's not a fun game when everything lives forever. So if everybody's just sitting there with 2+ save models bouncing off each other for the whole game, like our game, James, when we had Storm Drakes and Fulminators fighting each other for 2 turns and no damage done, that's not fun, right? It's satisfying from a tactical standpoint to place your buffs appropriately and get things in order. But if the whole game is like that all the time, it's not a very fun game.
Well, yeah, especially when both armies are sitting in one alley of the map.
Yeah. So let's take a look at an example here. Annihilators have 9 wounds, but a 2-up save for 200 points, which makes them very strong against standard attacks, but also very weak against mortal wounds, because D3 mortal wounds can kill an Annihilator, but D3 attacks are very unlikely to. But let's take a look at zombies. They have 20 wounds, no save, and a 6-up ward for 115 points. This makes them very, very weak to regular attacks, but very strong against mortal wounds. If you did D3 attacks against zombies, you're very likely to kill D3 zombies, whereas mortal wounds it's not that impactful. Doing D3 mortal wounds to 20 wounds of zombies is not as impactful as doing it to 9 wounds of Annihilators. And that is an intentional game design of Age of Sigmar, that mortal wounds are meant to counter some units. That's their goal. They are meant to counter high effective health units. If you're using a lot of Annihilators, obviously mortal wounds seem overpowered, right? But that's because mortal wounds are designed to counter units like Annihilators. So if mortal wounds counter effective health, are wards the counter to mortal wounds? No, because wards are just an increase in effective health. They work against all kinds of damage, mortal wounds and wounds alike. Andrasta is weaker to mortal wounds than 15 Liberators, right? Because 15 Liberators is 30 wounds, while Andrasta is effectively 16. So even though Andrasta has a 4-up ward, the equivalent amount of points of Liberators actually is stronger against mortal wounds than Andrasta.
I would say so. In the context of this conversation, that yes, wards are just an increased effective health. They're not necessarily a counter to mortal wounds. However, when we move from the model to model conversation and move to more of an aura, something like Guard of Steel Soul or the Battlesmith from Fire Slayers, they can be a counter to mortal wounds. So if your meta is full of a lot of 6s to do 1 mortal wounds or filled with Lumineth archers, in terms of gameplay, that is a counter, but not in terms of game mechanics.
Right, that's what I'm getting at, is that inherently just having a ward doesn't mean your unit is resistant to mortal wounds. It just means that it takes more damage to kill you, and mortal wounds are a low damage, high accuracy form of damage, right? They don't deal a lot of damage, but they do it very reliably.
Right.
And that could be the case if you have an attack on 2-up Rend 5. That's very accurate, but it's like having a mortal wound.
Mm-hmm.
So mortal wounds are low damage, and like we discussed, if you have 30 damage, you're trying to deal it to a 35 wound hero, it's not very effective, right? If you do 6 mortal wounds to a 5 wound support hero with a high save, let's say a Knight Incantor, doing 6 mortal wounds to a Knight Incantor is huge on the game. You've killed a key wizard and taken out the space that he was occupying. Whereas dealing 6 mortal wounds to, let's say, a big squad of zombies, 60 wounds, and they have a 6-up ward, that's almost nothing. You've accomplished basically nothing with that ability. And that's a very important ability, right? You can probably only use that once per turn.
Yep.
Mortal wounds are very powerful, but they're limited. They're a resource that has to be used appropriately. So if wards are not the game design counter to mortal wounds, what is the counter? Well, it's effective health. And indirectly, wards are an increase to effective health, but not directly. Am I making sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You are.
Okay. It feels like a roundabout way of saying it, but I think it's correct.
It does for the long, and I'm speaking from somebody who looks at mortal wounds as Murgunk said, just sort of like me- mechanically, that's what they seem to be, like an extra save roll against mortal wounds, but there's more at play there.
Right. So now we can talk about the overarching design of Age of Sigmar, and this is not strictly defined anywhere, but broadly speaking, you could categorize units and attacks and even armies into 3 categories, which I've called elite, horde, and snipers. These are not strict definitions or classifications, and units can be in multiple categories. You can have an elite sniper, you can have a horde sniper, you can have an elite horde. Those do exist as well. But hear me out, hear my logic, understand what I'm getting at. An elite is something that is expensive. It has a poor ratio of wounds per point, but it has high effective health through save rolls or ward rolls. And these high damage units are able to efficiently clear out hordes, right? So something like Annihilators, I would say, are an elite unit, right? They are 9 wounds for 240 points, but they do a ton of damage, and it takes significant resources to wipe them out because they do have a 3-up save.
Yep.
Horde units, they are many bodies or wounds for their points, and they have poor defenses. They have a high volume of attacks, but really poor accuracy, which means they struggle to slay elites. Right? Elites beat hordes. That's typically
without some support. Yes, yeah. Without proper buffing support.
Yeah. It's way more complicated than this, but this is like really broad strokes here.
Yeah. You got it.
And then snipers are low damage but very high accuracy. Typically mortal wounds. You can think of like a long strike raptor is a sniper. They can't deal enough damage to kill hordes, but they can deal the pinpoint damage you need in order to kill an elite. So let's say these 3 categories, elite would be something like an annihilator, a horde would be something like a zombie, and a sniper would be something like a long strike raptor. A long strike raptor can reliably kill an annihilator. Annihilators can tank hordes for days. They can tank a whole bunch of zombies. Well, maybe zombies aren't the best example because they do mortal wounds, but you know what I mean, right? Like clan rats or something.
Right. Like 100 skeletons. Like let's just say like 60 skeletons. Death rattle skeletons.
Yeah. And then those skeletons are really resilient against fire from long strikes because long strikes don't do enough damage to kill those skeletons in one turn. They need a lot more support than that. They're not a good use of points when you're facing that kind of unit. So elites beat hordes, but they lose to snipers. Hordes beat snipers, but they lose to elites. And this is a rock, paper, scissors dynamic that exists pretty much everywhere in Age of Sigmar. So if you're an army relying on 3-up saves, you're going to have a really hard time against mortal wounds. If there's an army like Stormcast, which has really good saves, against an army like Seraphon or Tzeentch or Lumineth that deal high mortal wounds, that's a rough matchup. An army relying on mortal wounds, however, really won't do much against an army of hundreds of wounds of chaff units. If you're that same Seraphon player and you're playing against 120 zombies, that's a rough matchup because you just don't have the maximum damage needed to reliably kill all those models. But then that army of 100 zombies is probably going to bounce off an army with 2+ saves. So it's this kind of dynamic, and it's everywhere in Age of Sigmar. So this brings us to the question, are mortal wounds overpowered? Mortal wounds are the intended counter to expensive units with good saves and poor wound ratios. Things like Annihilators are, by design, weak to mortal wounds. So if you use a lot of Annihilators, you might think mortal wounds are overpowered. Right? So depending on the kind of units you use, depending on the army you play, your opinion on this matter could be that mortal wounds are overpowered or they're fine. Right? Stormcast, Idoneth, Caradron, Seraphon, these are all elite armies that are typically weak to mortal wounds. They rely on save stacking and effective health to get through it. Armies like Fireslayers, Soulblight Gravelords, the Beasts of Chaos, Gits, Lumineth, they're a lot less worried about mortal wounds because they have ward saves or they just have tons of bodies or they can revive models. They're not that concerned with taking 6 mortal wounds from Kairos. So, are mortal wounds overpowered? I don't think so. I think they're just a tool in the game that exists for a specific purpose. And if you happen to be the thing that it's beating, you might think that they're too strong. That said, mortal wounds can run rampant. If it's a very delicate balance you have to hit with this kind of mechanic. They can become a serious problem to the game. Now, if they do, I think the meta will evolve. And I actually think we're seeing that right now in Age of Sigmar 3.1, where Stormdrakes are this kind of elite sniper unit, right? They can take damage really well, but they don't deal a lot of damage. So people are adapting to this by bringing in big hordes of units that can just weather the damage of Stormdrakes.
Yeah. Well, the other thing is, like you mentioned, there is a delicate balance to be maintained, because before the points updates and the data slate changes or whatever, when you look at an army like Lumineth, where everything does mortal wounds on 6s, like damn near everything, that's a problem. That can become a problem for the game, because that means all their units also have the volume of attacks plus also the mortal wounds to get through elite saves. So they're breaking that delicate rock paper scissors balance, and that's why that mechanic isn't very nice to play against, in my opinion.
Yeah, you see examples every now and then of units that are just, oh, that's a lot of mortal wounds for no reason, like Stormdrake Guard with their breath attack. Sometimes they do 2 mortal wounds, sometimes they do 11. That kind of high variance isn't very fun to play against. So that begs the question, are mortal wounds ruining the game? I've heard people discuss this. And there's an argument here, because it's not fun when nothing dies, like we said, but it's also not fun when everything dies all the time way too quickly, right? If the game is just being decided by who gets the double on turn 2, on 1 and 2, it's not that interesting of a game, right? Mortal wounds are also a little different, because you don't get to typically make a roll for it. Your opponent just says, you take this many wounds, and you lose models. And it doesn't really feel like you're interacting with your opponent at all. It doesn't feel like you're playing the game. Your opponent's playing the game and telling you what to do, which it's not very fun. Another issue is that mortal wounds, because they're high accuracy, they're reliable, right? You don't have to hit, you don't have to wound, you don't have to save, just take mortal wounds. Reliability is very powerful in Age of Sigmar. So even if mortal wounds are not overpowered, it's not very fun to play against a lot of them, right? Even if you don't play a list like Stormcast, which is very weak to mortal wounds, it's just not fun to play against random mortal wound spikes from Stormdrake Guard. That's not enjoyable. So overall, it's not the biggest problem in the game right now, but maybe it's better to get ahead of the curve and add in things like Ignax's Scales from 2nd edition. It was an artifact that gave a hero a 4-up ward against mortal wounds. Maybe we bring that back into the game. Maybe we could introduce a new universal command ability or heroic action that mitigates mortal wounds in some ways. Maybe we can change Finest Hour instead of granting a bonus to save rolls. Maybe that can give a ward against mortals. These are all just, hand-wavy ideas. Maybe we get ahead of this. Maybe it's not a problem at all. What do you guys think? Are mortal wounds ruining the game?
No, not in my opinion.
No, I think so far I've seen them pretty well balanced, because I try to imagine what a world without or with lesser mortal wounds in Age of Sigmar would look like. And man, these save stacking things like I don't know, Kragnos or like a Maw Crusher or these god monsters, like Nagash, even though they have a 4-up mortal wound save, they would just be way too prevalent, in my opinion. And it's nice that mortal wounds are like the sort of counter to that.
Yeah, I think a good example of what's happening right now is Kragnos. He's a 2-up save with a 6-up ward, and he can save stack. He can use Finest Hour, Mystic Shield, and All-Out Defense. And he can be really, really tough to take down, right? Because with save stacking, he can reliably ignore Rend 2 for at least 1 turn of the game. And you need a lot of mortal wounds to kill him. He has 18 wounds. That's a lot. And they can't come from spells, because he ignores spells on a 3d6. So he can be really tough to take down. But because he's so expensive, he's actually not broken in any way, I don't think. Or maybe he is. I don't know. I'll have to playtest more, but Kragnos feels like a tough nut to crack, and that's fine. He's a god. He's like a destruction god. He's meant to be durable. If you put a model like Kragnos on the table and your opponent just sniped it turn 1, that wouldn't be very fun.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a tough line to walk. I think right now it's okay, but it could become a problem. All right. Do we want to record any closing thoughts before we move on to the final slide?
Yeah, in in this sense, like mortal wounds, in my opinion, are a critical part of the game. I think in second edition we just saw a lots of waste where they just got spammed, but not a lot of ways to counter them. And I think more and more armies are seeing ways to counter them, or not counter them, but like increase their effective health, like we said, and just help sort of balance that out, where you don't feel like everything is just dying to mortal wounds. And so I have a positive outlook on 3.0 and its relationship on mortal wounds and the game design going forward.
Yeah, it seemed really terrifying that Stormcast got Gardas and access to a 5+ ward aura, and Ideneth are getting 5+ wards on a lot of heroes, and their Namarti can get access to a 5+ ward. But I don't think it's going to make these armies too difficult to kill. I think this is a response to the natural design of the game, which they're trying to increase save rolls because it's fun, which means they need to increase the mortal wounds as well. And because they're increasing mortal wounds, you need to have some wards on some characters, because it would be really weird if Thralls were 2 wounds apiece, for example. Whereas Thralls with a 5+ ward makes sense more thematically and narratively, and there's counterplay there. Whereas if Thralls were just 2 wounds apiece all the time, it would be really weird.
Yeah.
Okay, and that's it. Leave your thoughts on mortal wounds and effective health and all that stuff in the comments. We love hearing your guys' opinions, so hit us up. Let us know what you think.